Jasmine Crockett's decision to mock Karoline Leavitt's educational background during a public appearance may have been calculated for applause or a viral soundbite, but it ended up exposing a deeper layer of the political spectacle. The moment was charged with the usual theatrics common in today's discourse. A swipe meant to discredit, a jab at someone's academic resume, framed as a sign of incompetence or lack of legitimacy. Yet what unfolded next turned the room on its head. Not because of Crockett's words, but because someone unexpected decided to speak up. The mocking tone wasn't just a dig at an individual. It carried an unspoken suggestion that only certain educational pathways are worthy of power, influence, or public trust. That mindset, that elitist framing, has quietly crept into how many evaluate credibility. When someone stands behind a microphone and uses education as a weapon, especially in a country where access to higher learning is riddled with systemic barriers, it says more about their values than about their target. In that room, there was a pause after the laughter, an emptiness that hung in the air just long enough for it to be noticeable. It wasn't just awkwardness. It was the kind of silence that forms when people aren't entirely sure if they should have clapped. Then a student stood up, not with outrage, not with insults, but with clarity and a sense of purpose that outshone the earlier performance. This wasn't a political figure or a media-trained activist, just someone who heard enough and decided it was time to recalibrate the conversation. The student didn't defend a person, they defended an idea, that education is diverse, that people come from different backgrounds, and that no single route defines intelligence or leadership. There was no need for theatrics. The student spoke plainly, explaining that measuring someone's worth by the prestige of their school or the letters after their name misses the point entirely. What matters is how one applies what they know, how they treat others, and whether they are grounded in real-world experience. The student talked about classmates who work 2 jobs, who support their families, who didn't have the luxury to attend a top-tier institution, but still show up every day, striving to be better. They mentioned the concept of earned perspective, how lived experiences teach lessons no classroom ever could. It was in that moment that the tone in the room shifted. The energy, which had briefly surged from Crockett's remarks, suddenly cooled into something more contemplative. The student's message hit on something authentic, something often missing from these highly produced political spectacles: humility. While the mockery tried to draw a line between the so-called qualified and unqualified, the student blurred that line with truth and empathy. They reframed the narrative, challenging everyone in that space to reconsider what qualifies. Someone to lead. There was no yelling, no chest thumping, just a calm, well-articulated assertion that mocking someone's education, especially when it likely reflects a story of perseverance rather than privilege, says more about the mocker than the mocked. The student didn't just defend one individual, they gave voice to thousands whose stories are often overlooked, who are dismissed not for lack of intelligence or drive, but simply because their path looks different. It was a powerful disruption, not because it was loud, but because it was grounded. The student's intervention dismantled the elitist undertones embedded in the mockery, revealing just how detached such comments can be from the lived realities of everyday people. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a reminder that leadership is about connection, resilience, and understanding, not academic pedigree. What started as a moment designed for applause turned into a lesson no one expected. The student didn't come for attention or accolades. They spoke because something needed to be said, and when they did, it was impossible to ignore. The moment was supposed to be simple. A politician had just finished delivering a cutting line about someone's education, laced with sarcasm and designed to trigger laughter, maybe even some applause. It played well to a crowd eager for entertainment, not unlike a punchline delivered from a stage rather than a podium. For a few seconds, it seemed like the spectacle would continue down the usual path, mockery feeding more mockery, the audience sinking deeper into a rhythm of affirmation. But then quietly and without fanfare, a student stood up. The student didn't raise their voice. They didn't wave their hands or call for attention. What they did was far more impactful. They asked for reason. There was no allegiance in their tone, no blind defense of any one individual. Instead, there was a demand for clarity, for maturity, and for dignity. And just like that, the tone of the room began to shift. Laughter gave way to uncertainty. The heat from the previous speaker's mockery was still lingering, but it quickly started to evaporate. As the student began to speak, the entire exchange took on a different meaning. They didn't challenge the politics behind the statement, they challenged the principles. Their words weren't delivered like an attack, but more like an observation, the kind you can't ignore because it reveals something uncomfortable. The student noted with remarkable poise that reducing someone's capability to the name of a school they attended or the letters on their diploma is both outdated and unjust. In a country where education is unevenly distributed, where opportunities are influenced by zip codes, economic status, and access, such mockery isn't edgy, it's exclusionary. The student wasn't just pushing back against a moment of sarcasm, they were pushing back against an entire way of thinking. They explained that countless people come through alternative educational paths, community colleges, online programs, military service, vocational training, and they go on to lead to solve problems, to serve communities. And yet their qualifications are often diminished simply because they didn't take the expected route. That, the student emphasized, is not only unfair, it's deeply unwise. What made the student's intervention even more impactful was the calm conviction behind it. There was no need to shout. The silence in the room did more than any raised voice could have. People started listening not just because of what was said, but because of the contrast it presented. Just moments earlier, mockery had been met with cheer. Now, thoughtful critique was met with stillness, as if the entire room recognized it had crossed a line and needed to find its way back. The student didn't position themselves as a savior, and they didn't turn the moment into a speech about themselves. They just told the truth. They mentioned classmates who came from working-class families, some who were first-generation college students, and others who faced barriers most wouldn't even understand. These were people who carried the weight of expectation and survival, often working through the night, commuting for hours, juggling family responsibilities, still managing to excel. Were their contributions less meaningful because they didn't come with Ivy League credentials? The student asked the question not to provoke, but to remind. What followed wasn't dramatic. There was no thunderous applause or viral mic drop. But something more important happened. Reflection. The room, once eager for the next laugh, found itself caught in a different kind of moment, one defined by listening rather than reacting. The student had not only disrupted the flow of performance, they had introduced substance. In an age where public discourse is often reduced to gotchas and viral zingers, the student brought something old-fashioned and rare: respect. They respected the audience enough to tell them the truth. They respected the person being mocked enough not to allow it to pass unchallenged. And most importantly, they respected the idea that public service should be rooted in character and commitment, not credentials. They didn't ask for a side to be taken. They asked for decency. And in doing so, they revealed how quickly the crowd can pivot when someone dares to speak with integrity instead of volume. It was the kind of moment that doesn't just change the mood, it changes the memory. What unfolded in that room was more than a clash of opinions. It was a revealing display of two different approaches to leadership and communication. One was flashy, pointed, and performative. The other was grounded, sincere, and purposeful. On one side, a political figure leaned into mockery, using someone's educational background as a way to diminish their legitimacy. The delivery was sharp, the tone unmistakably smug. It was less about insight and more about drawing a line between who belongs in the conversation and who supposedly doesn't. The audience reacted with laughter, quick to validate the performance. But that applause came from a place of familiarity, a conditioned response to style rather than substance. The underlying message wasn't just a critique of one person's path, it was a veiled endorsement of a narrow definition of qualification. A certain kind of education, a certain pedigree, a certain resume, that's what counts, or so the message implied. It was a moment meant to elevate the speaker by delegitimizing another, as if schooling and credentials alone determine value. But in the crowd was a student who clearly saw through the act. They didn't let the moment slide. With measured words, they stepped forward, not to create a spectacle of their own, but to shift the lens completely. The student's response wasn't scripted or polished for effect. It was raw in the best way, honest, intelligent, and rooted in real-world awareness. Instead of playing the game of credentials, they chose to talk about the lived experience behind education, the barriers, the sacrifices, and the resilience that rarely make it into public debate. They weren't defending a specific school or degree. They were defending the dignity of people who rise without the privileges that often smooth the road for others. Their words served as a quiet but firm reminder that intelligence doesn't always wear the trappings of elitism, and that leadership can emerge from grit as much as it does from institutional polish. This contrast laid bare the difference between style and substance. One person brought flair, but it lacked depth. The student, on the other hand, brought clarity and purpose. Their intervention didn't just challenge a political jab, it challenged an entire framework of judgment. It reminded everyone listening that those who serve, lead, or make change don't always come with titles or ivy-covered diplomas. Many of them come from places where education is a struggle, where choices are shaped by necessity more than ambition, where the path to success isn't linear, but forged step by step under pressure. In that moment, the student became a stand-in for countless others, people whose stories are often reduced to stereotypes or overlooked entirely. They represented those who can't afford to play the prestige game, but are no less capable, thoughtful, or impactful. What made the students' words powerful wasn't just what they said, it was what they made everyone feel. They made the room pause. That pause said everything. It revealed the discomfort that comes when a truth is laid bare with no theatrics. No anger, just steady conviction. The choice not to respond with mockery in return was itself a powerful statement. The student elevated the conversation without ever descending into the tactics that sparked the exchange in the first place. Instead of slinging insults, they posed a moral challenge. What do we really value in our leaders? Is it the image we've been sold, polished, pedigreed, and detached? Or is it the ability to understand people, to listen, to show up with empathy and authenticity? The room, which moments earlier had felt swept up in the rhythm of political entertainment, now found itself sitting with something much heavier. It wasn't embarrassment, it was reconsideration. A shift in awareness, however brief, that exposed the hollowness behind mocking someone's path. The student didn't just respond, they redefined the terms of the conversation. They reminded the audience that the loudest voice isn't always the wisest, and that intellect, compassion, and leadership often come wrapped in humility, not bravado. Where one side sought attention, the other sought understanding. Where one played to the crowd, the other spoke to its conscience. And in doing so, the student left a mark far deeper than the original line ever could. The moment began as another clip primed for virality. A well-known figure stood at the front of the room, delivering a sharp-tongued jab about someone's education. It was calculated, dressed up in comedic timing, and layered with the kind of sarcasm that tends to grab headlines. Cameras rolled, cell phones recorded, and the crowd reacted on cue, chuckling, nodding, some even applauding. On the surface, it looked like another clean win in the age of performative politics, where landing a line often matters more than making a point. But then something unexpected happened. A student in the audience, unrehearsed, unaffiliated, and unshaken, stood up and decided to speak. There was no spectacle in their posture, no demand for the spotlight. They didn't raise their voice or inject drama into their words. Instead, they spoke with quiet certainty, disrupting the flow of the moment not with noise but with sense. This wasn't a rebuttal designed for virality. It was something far rarer, a reality check. The student didn't attack the speaker personally. They didn't match mockery with mockery. They simply spoke from a place of honesty, drawing attention back to what really matters. They reminded the room that education isn't a monolith, and that people pursue knowledge and growth through 1,000 different doors, many of them less traveled and far more difficult. They spoke of peers who work 2 or 3 jobs to put themselves through school, who live in small apartments, who don't have the benefit of legacy or wealth but still show up to class, still study late into the night, still believe in their ability to make something meaningful out of what they have. They spoke of people whose achievements aren't worn on their sleeves, but carried in their quiet perseverance. It was a reflection, not just of one person's journey, but of an entire demographic whose stories rarely make it to the podium. As they spoke, the atmosphere in the room began to change. What had moments earlier been an audience leaning forward with amusement was now a room leaning back in reflection. The laughter stopped, not because someone said it should, but because the tone shifted to something undeniably real. The student didn't need a microphone or a title. Their authenticity was louder than any punchline. This moment wasn't just about defending a person, it was about defending a principle. The student rejected the idea that a resume alone can determine someone's worth or that academic prestige is the sole gateway to leadership. They weren't naive about the world. They understood that perception matters. But they also understood that when those perceptions are used to diminish rather than uplift, to divide rather than connect, something fundamental is lost. In a culture increasingly addicted to image, the student offered substance. In an environment obsessed with takedowns, they offered perspective. And that contrast is what made their words unforgettable. It wasn't just that they spoke up. It was that they spoke up in a way that elevated the entire room. No yelling, no retaliation. Just a straightforward call to rethink what we celebrate in others, and why. After the student finished, there was no immediate roar of applause. There didn't need to be. The silence that followed was heavier than any ovation. It was a shared moment of recognition that something true had been said, something that couldn't be laughed away or edited down for a clip. The room had been caught mid-performance and shown something far more honest. In that moment, the student didn't just steal the spotlight, they reshaped it. They redirected attention away from a flashy insult and toward something enduring. The dignity of hard work, the value of multiple paths, the courage to speak truth when silence is easier. It wasn't a moment designed to trend. It was a moment meant to last. And in its quiet, unplanned power, it did something that few political performances managed to achieve. It made people think. What happened in that room may have started with mockery, but it ended with meaning. In a political landscape where spectacle often overshadows sincerity, where applause is mistaken for approval, and where power is too often measured by performance, one student managed to reset the tone with nothing more than truth. They reminded everyone that leadership isn't born out of prestige, but out of principle. That intelligence can't be confined to degrees or institutional recognition. And that dignity is not something that can be granted or taken away by someone with a microphone and a clever line. The impact of the student's words went far beyond that room. It cut through the noise of partisan games and reminded people of something deeper, the human element in public discourse. In an era when so many voices are dismissed because they don't come from the right place, the student stood as proof that wisdom and strength don't require permission. Their perspective wasn't filtered through ideology or agenda. It was personal, lived, and impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a clash of personalities or a viral exchange. It was a defining moment about what we choose to value. Do we admire those who demean others for a laugh, or those who speak up for fairness? Do we want leaders who posture and provoke, or those who listen and understand? That day, the student challenged the room and everyone watching to think carefully about their answer. The silence that followed their speech wasn't empty. It was full of realization. It marked a turning point in the conversation, a shift from amusement to reflection. And while the spotlight eventually moved on, as it always does, the impression of that moment lingered. Because every once in a while, someone steps out of the audience and changes the narrative, not by shouting over it, but by offering a better one. And in doing so, they prove that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room isn't the one behind the podium. It's the one that speaks when no one expects it.